welcome to this conversation on race, liberation, and Palestine. My name is Dr. Brittany Cooper. I am Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Africana Studies here at Rutgers. Whoop! You need a seat. Come on and find your seat. And do it like we do in my religious context. Just put your finger up.
Church!
So, I want to begin with grief. Grief is a place that I live a lot these days, and I was wondering how to show up here. Earlier this year, I lost my mother, and today is her birthday. And it is her first birthday that we are not together. And as I was thinking about what I might offer in this conversation on race, liberation, and Palestine, is what we do with our grief and what our grief requires of us. And the moments when we realize that there are struggles that are bigger than our personal loss and our personal pain. But I am also reflecting on the gift of today, because the thing that happens in grief when you lose someone, if you have done the work of building community, or you're blessed to have it, is that you gather. And in the gathering, you begin to tell the story of who we are, how we are connected, and what it looks like for us to go forward. That is what we are here to do today. In our grief, as we continue to figure out how to go forward, as atrocity continues, as terror continues, as violence continues, what I want to invite you to do is a thing that I have to do many moments every single day. And that is breathe into the depth of the grief and the pain, and then be reminded that we are still here. And we are all we have. And when we recognize the preciousness of the fact that we are all we have, that then settles the stakes of what it means for us to get it right. I was asked to come and introduce this auspicious panel of scholars in line with and as an act of solidarity because of the long history of Black freedom fighters who have supported the struggle for Palestinian liberation. I stand in that tradition, and that tradition includes MLK, and it includes June Jordan, and it includes Beverly Shefdall, and it includes Barbara Ransby, and it includes Angela Davis, and it includes my brother, Marc Lamont Hill, and so many others. And I want to add, because I'm never not crying, that I have been very bothered by those who have tried to co-opt Black freedom struggles and tell Black people where we ought to stand, and have felt entitled to tell us what our own struggles for freedom in this country mean for who is deserving of our solidarity. Right. No one gets to tell us. And so what I would offer to you is that the thing that links me together with these auspicious panelists is that we understand the ways in which actual histories of religious persecution have been used as the pretext for colonization. That's the harsh way to say it. The more generous way to say it is that colonization has been offered as a salve for religious persecution. Neither version of that story is sufficient. And so today we're going to listen to these scholars to help us make sense of our story. And we're going to do that as a constituted community of scholars who has the ability to hold complexity in the midst of grief and potentially great disagreement. And we're going to do it because these are folks we can trust, even if we disagree. What we can trust is their commitment to freedom. What we can trust is their commitment to building a world that is better for all. What we can trust is their commitment for us to figure out how to live more justly in community together. Dr. Nick Estes is an enrolled member of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe and is an assistant professor in American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota. He studies colonialism and global indigenous histories, focusing on decolonization, oral history, U.S. imperialism, environmental justice, anti-capitalism, and the Osete Sokolin, the indigenous and First Nations peoples of the Great Plains of North America. Forgive me, my brother, for butchering the names. He is the author of the award-winning book, Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance, and many other works, and also was an American Democracy Fellow at the Charles Warren Center for Study of History at Harvard, a Lannan Literary Fellow, and a Marguerite Casey Foundation Freedom Fellow, among many other accolades. Welcome, Dr. Estes. Dr. Marc Lamont Hill is Presidential Professor at the City University of New York Graduate Center, where he teaches courses in anthropology, urban education, and Middle Eastern studies. He has held positions at Morehouse College, Temple University, and Columbia University. He is a cultural anthropologist, critical policy scholar, and radical educator whose work explores issues of race, education, citizenship, and state violence in the United States and the Middle East. He holds a PhD with distinction from the University of Pennsylvania, and he is the author of 8 books, so many books that I cannot keep up. Perhaps of note, Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics, which came out with the New Press in 2021 and which won the 2021 Palestine Book Award. And then we have Rutgers' very own Professor Noura Erakat, a human rights attorney and associate professor in the Department of Africana Studies and the Program in Criminal Justice. Her research interests include human rights law, humanitarian law, national security law, refugee law, social justice, and critical race theory. Noura is an editorial committee member of the Journal for Palestine Studies and a co-founding editor of Jadaliyah, an electronic magazine on the Middle East that combines scholarly expertise and local knowledge. She is the author of Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine, a book called, quote, Brilliant and Inspiring by Carter Professor of General Jurisprudence Emeritus Duncan Kennedy at Harvard Law School, and called Precisely the Book We Need at This Time by Angela Davis. I am honored to have her. My colleague, Professor Sylvia Chan-Malik, Associate Professor of the Departments of American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies here at Rutgers, New Brunswick, where she teaches courses on race and ethnicity, Islam in America, and race and religion. She is the author of Being Muslim, A Cultural History of Women of Color in the United States, and is currently working on a forthcoming volume titled A Part of Islam, A Journey Through Muslim America. Y'all, let me be my black preacher self and tell you, we're going to act right today. We're going to deal with each other with care today.
That's right.
All right? Let us model together today the world we want to see. Because we cannot say that we want revolution, we cannot say that we want justice, we cannot say that we want an end to war and an end to violence and then show up in rooms in privileged spaces with protection and treat each other in violent fashion.
Yes.
So today, in this moment, we can model the people that we want to be and the world we want to build by our ability to sit together and hold complexity. That is my charge, and it is also my request.
So thank you, Professor Cooper, Dr. Cooper, my friend, my colleague. And good afternoon and welcome to everyone here. So as my dear friend Brittany just said, my name is Sylvia Chan Malik. I am faculty here. I will be moderating this conversation, but if you will just indulge me for a moment to say a few words about the seminar and the larger program this year that this today's event is a part of. I'm very proud to be one of the primary investigators, along with Dr. Radhika Balakrishnan and Professor Noura Erakat, of a year-long Sawyer seminar that today's event is a part of, titled The Afterlives of Liberation, Anti-Racist Praxis for the 21st Century. We have an amazing seminar team that got this event together. We've had a lot of twists and turns to get here, so I want to shout them out, take a moment. Our amazing, let me shout them out. Our amazing postdoctoral fellow in Black Liberation Studies, Brendan Tynes. Where are you, Brendan? She's working. Our dissertation fellow, Diana Molina, who's here, and our other fellow, Mish Ling, who couldn't be here, our videographer right here, Andrew Niaga, and our wonderful seminar administrators, Candy Behrman, Aretha Creighton, and Nimra Saeed. I also would like to thank additional volunteers assisting us with this event, Emily Mankoff and Nusrat Yusuf. I know we have two more. You have to come tell me. I'll say your names in a minute. And finally, I want to shout out our co-sponsors for this event. And let me tell you, it was something to get co-sponsors for this event. The Center for Middle Eastern Studies, the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice, the Center for Security, Race and Rights, the Asian Student Council, the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and the Department of Africana Studies. We appreciate you all. Please check our website. We have another wonderful event that Noura helped us plan coming up on February 1st with wonderful activists that continues this conversation around anti-racism and activism. So again, indulge me a few words. I want to say a few words about our seminar to convey the significance and meaning of today's event and the histories and legacies that gather us here today. This seminar grew out of the work of a group called the BIPOC Faculty Caucus here at Rutgers in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd in 2020 to organize the Rutgers community to come together and imagine truly transformative approaches to the work of racial justice. For all of us, this work long preceded 2020. All of us on the caucus are scholars of race and racism in the US and beyond, who study Blackness and anti-Blackness, indigeneity and settler colonialism, migration and diaspora, refugee displacement, and the expressions of racialization and racism we reckon with each day. Our seminar title, The Afterlives of Liberation, gestures towards the third world and internationalist liberation movements of the 1960s and 70s in the US and beyond, Black, brown, indigenous, Asian, anti-war, anti-capitalist, and revolutionary struggles that forever change the world and construct how we think about race and liberation today. Through our programming, we seek to imagine a university that goes beyond diversity, equity, inclusion, and seeks true racial justice and repair in all its myriad forms. So though it might already seem obvious, today's program perfectly encapsulates our seminar's aims, which is precisely why our team put it back together in early September of this year, long before the crisis we currently find ourselves in, though wholly in the midst of a 75-year occupation of Palestine. And as my colleague Brittany already gestured towards, the question of Palestine and the long histories of internationalist, coalitional, and interlinked struggles between Black, Indigenous, and Palestinian people are central to conversations around race and liberation. As scholar and former political prisoner Angela Davis has said, Palestine is a moral litmus test for the world. It has the potential to further transform and render more capacious the political consciousness of our contemporary movements. or as Native Hawaiian scholar J. Kaolani Kauanui has written, Israel's mistreatment of Palestinians is modeled on the U.S. violence against Native Americans, especially with regard to frontier-era wars of aggression, expulsion, and forced removal. Such connections are reflected time and time again, for example, in almost a decade of solidarity statements with the Palestinian struggle issued by the American Studies Association, the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, the Asian American Studies Association, and most recently by Black for Palestine, in which over 6,000 Black activists, artists, scholars, and students, and over 225 organizations signed a statement expressing Black solidarity with Gaza and demanding a ceasefire now. All of which is to say that today's topic falls in a long-standing tradition around race liberation in Palestine that scholars, activists, and concerned individuals have been having for years, decades to be precise. This tradition includes Black intellectuals like Angela Davis, James Baldwin, Malcolm X, June Jordan, Audre Lorde, Robin D.G. Kelly, Barbara Ransby, and Beverly Guy Sheftall, as well as Indigenous scholars like Robert Warrior, J. Kaolani Kauanui, Leanne Simpson, and Audra Simpson, just to name a few. So in this tradition today, we extend this to the work of the three amazing folks that we have here, Dr. Estes, Dr. Marc Lamont Hill, and Professor Noura. And as the world we are confronted with today shows, this is an urgent, necessary topic with a group of scholars and thinkers we urgently need in order to teach us histories and ideas we must understand so we can meet this moment that we are in right now with knowledge and clarity, with connection and relation to one another, and to the histories and struggles that have come before us and shape our present. Really quickly, I know many of you know this. I want to stay focused, and you're not here to hear me. But I want to take a moment and share some context. I want to share with you that our event provoked over 8,000 emails to our university president's office asking to them to cancel it, including numerous petitions and a letter from a sitting member of Congress. I want to share that our seminar email and registration has been filled with hateful comments and threats for weeks on end. And I want to share that there has been vicious smears and remarks directed at our speakers, full of statements that are patently and verifiably false. I want to share that here in our privilege and safety as American academics, in our privilege and relative safety here at an American university, defending academic freedom and bringing critical voices to our students and community are the bare minimum that we can do. And finally, and I will shut up, I want to thank all of you. Look at this beautiful and diverse group of people for being here today to hear our speakers so that we can learn, listen, and be in community. To close my remarks, I do want to thank Rutgers President Jonathan Holloway and our New Brunswick Chancellor Francine Conway for their commitment to academic freedom and intellectual expression in these challenging and often terrifying times. So thank you. So thank you to Marc, Noura, and Nick for being here. We're so grateful. And so I want to start with a check-in on our current moment. Every day we need to check in. A catastrophe that killed 1,200 Israelis on October 7th, and at last count, almost 20,000 Palestinians in Gaza, a number which will likely be higher by the end of this conversation. There's been massive protests around the world, there's been a pause, and now we watch in horror once again as this violence resumes. Noura, I wonder if you can just start us off by situating us in the now, what's happening on the ground in Gaza as you know it, as well as the larger political context that are shaping what Israeli Holocaust scholar Omer Bartov says is Israel's clear intentions of ethnic cleansing, and what UN Special Rapporteur to Palestine, Francesca Albanese, calls a genocide unfolding before our eyes.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you so much, Brittany, for that grounding with the spirit in which you've done it and invited us in. Thank you to my kin who are here today, who I've worked with multiple times in the tradition that's been lifted today. This, unlike, I should say, almost everything else done in these days reflects work that we have been doing for decades, work that precedes us beginning to do this work in the past few decades. In fact, the scarf I wear here was gifted to me from the Red Nation in Albuquerque, New Mexico, by Nick and other compas. I have nothing gifted to me from Marc right now. But a lot of the ideas I will share have been cultivated, have been cultivated in our scholarly collaboration and our political joint commitments to freedom. And so where are we today? None of this is prepared. None of this is prepared because, like all of the Palestinian students especially, and I see you and I salute you, and we are grieving together. Every day is its own day. We wake up and we're not sure what today is going to be like and what will face us. It has been now 62 days as our kin have been enduring an unfolding genocide, as people point fingers at us and call us aggressors. As legislative responses and university responses and social responses and media responses have tried to erect the mechanisms in order to incapacitate us and lessen us as a threat, even as we're enduring an ongoing genocide. How does one capture that in the world that we live in? And obviously, I think we're going to answer that this is captured in the racial and colonial structures that have built our reality that we know today. Palestinians are certainly, in the words of Professor Shireen Abu Akleh, living through an apocalypse. But we are not the first to endure apocalypse. We are amongst many in this room who come from those legacies, as Nick has pointed out, multiple apocalypses of Native people, as descendants of Africans who were kidnapped and enslaved, the descendants of those who have endured multiple apocalypses from the transatlantic slave trade through enslavement, through a continuous racial colonial structure that led the Civil Rights Congress to charge the US with genocide in 1951. This is a memory we know and an experience that is not unique to us. And in our effort not to exceptionalize it, it is both to point out what is unique, but to emphasize that it is not new nor special to us and why we're gathered. The first time we did a teach-in, just on where I'm at personally, the first time we did a teach-in with Professor Maya Mekdashi and Professor Sylvia Sean Malik and Dylan Rodriguez.
Sorry, Dylan.
I left. I left before the seminar was over because I received news that a dear friend of mine, Ahmed Aburtima, had been injured and his infant son had been killed. And today, before I entered this room, we learned that Rifat al-Arir has been killed. And it echoes what Palestinians have been screaming from the ground, right? It echoes what they're telling us, and I want to invoke them because so much of this work is to invisibilize Palestinians. They don't exist. They never had a land that they lived on that is worth defending. If you don't have land, you have no right to self-defense. If you have no right to self-defense, how is it that you can legitimately protect it? Your land or yourself. So I want to bring in a few Palestinians. Mu'taz Aziza wrote to us just a few days ago that guys from my age around the world are busy with their careers, travel, their loved ones, and planning for their future. Here, you can't even make a plan for the next 5 minutes. So I want to share with you that on day 62, some 16,000 Palestinians, more than 20,000 if we count who's still missing beneath the rubble, right, have been killed. And that 46,000 have been injured. And many have tried to convey that to audiences by analogy. Consider that this number of children exceeds the number of all kindergarten children in Denver, Colorado. Consider that this is more than the number of people killed, or 50% of the number of people killed in the 20 years of US war and occupation of Afghanistan. And yet what we cannot mobilize is the empathy for this condition without analogy. Without analogy. Precisely because of the work that racism has done to dehumanize a people so thoroughly that we can all, even those who are in opposition, can feel that this is tragic, but also understand it as common sense. You expect us to die. You expect us to suffer. And yet we're not alone in that condition. So for 62 days, this has gone on. There was a brief reprieve of a pause between day 49 and day 55. I don't know how you have gone through, but my days have become numbered and assigned as such. We had a brief pause during that time, but what has continued is precisely what the UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese has said is an unfolding genocide. It's what the Center for Constitutional Rights has said is an unfolding genocide in a petition to charge Blinken and Biden with a duty to prevent genocide, because that is what the 1948 Convention says. It's not about punishment, it's not retroactive, it's meant to prevent. It is what a UN panel of experts have said was genocide on October 15th, and what 750 scholars said was genocide on October 19th. It's what I have said, along with my colleagues, as we filed a petition to the International Criminal Court, charging Netanyahu and Herzog and Aliyan with genocide, apartheid, with war crimes, failure to distinguish between civilian and combatant, failure to launch military attacks that are proportionate to the military advantage to be achieved. And yet, what do we hear in response to any of these claims? Nothing but a discourse without anything else, a floating signifier of Hamas. Hamas. I can tell you about Rifat and the response will be, but Hamas. I can tell you about 6,000 children who have been killed and the response will be, but Hamas. I can tell you about premature babies rotting, left to rot in a hospital that medical personnel were forced to evacuate, and I will be told, Hamas. And what's so violent about this response, obviously there's much we'll unpack, but the most violent piece of it is how lazy the response is. How lazy, how horribly easy it is to provide that response without scrutiny, without verification, without investigation, without discussion, without context, without nuance. So, in our struggle now, 62 days inwards, as the bombardment has resumed, even after we have found out so much, even after investigation has revealed so much, including a Haaretz investigation that has told us that there's been I'm not going to repeat them here. I want to uphold the sanctity of all civilian life, but also emphasize here that that wasn't enough, that so much has been embellished precisely in order to hit on the nerve of your fear of the barbaric, lustful, violent Muslim Palestinian, who if Israel doesn't protect us on the Eastern Front, that they will come to get us all too, right? That this disinformation has been disemboweled. And yet it is not enough. After 62 days, the UNGA President Antonio Guterres has invoked Article 99. It's not been used, but so has the General Assembly invoked Uniting for Peace, which is not these are both mechanisms in order to overcome Security Council intransigence on issues. And yet we still see that a permanent ceasefire is not forthcoming. It has been shown to us, sorry, I mentioned all these legal documentations. Let me tell you quickly what genocide is in the convention, which, by the way, only gets legislated in 1948. But we know, as our peoples know, that genocide has been practiced far before 1948 across many geographies. But in that moment, it's legislated as having two particular parts. One is the specific intent to destroy in whole or in part a people based on their racial, ethnical, national, or religious grounds. And two, the specific underlying acts to achieve it. The hardest piece to ever prove here is the specific intent, because most genocidal forces do it in the course of war, and so it becomes war, which is what we're hearing. But in this case, it's far different. Israel has told us over and over and over again it is genocidal. They've told us over and over again it's to turn Gaza into a parking lot. They've told us over and over there are no Palestinian civilians. They've told us that they're human animals. They told us that they never deserve to live. They've told us that if their self-defense is tantamount to, that decimating Hamas is tantamount to destroying all of Gaza and depopulating it, that that's what it is and we should accept it. They have literally told us themselves. And the second part is what they've done. The prohibition of water, the restriction of fuel, the decimation as of November 29th, 26 out of 35 hospitals, the targeting of humanitarian corridors, the forcibly removing, the forced evacuation of 1.2 million people above the Wadi Gaza line, southward, to take refuge so that they can clear out the north, where they promised there was a command and control center between the Al-Shifa hospital. That President Biden said he had U.S. military intelligence that told him such, where no command and control center existed. And now they're targeting the precise places they told people to evacuate. And we are witnessing, in this hour, the worst and most severe escalation of bombardment of Palestinians. The worst and most severe. Things that we're sharing, but it's really hard to share when young men are arriving in Khan Yunis with their families' body parts in bags. But here again, we can tell you this, we can show you this, and yet the response is this fervent, yes, but it's your fault. And so we do what those before us have always done, which is to create the world we want to see, which is to create that other world possible, which is to do what C.L.R. James said in 1935 when the League of Nations failed to stop Mussolini from its invasion of Abyssinia or Ethiopia and said, we don't need the League of Nations, we will mobilize a labor strike. And here too, we turn to people power. So with that, I just want to end before I turn it to the people with power, all of us, is to just share with you a couple more quotes that I really feel I must share. Medics in Gaza, a nurse said, if we are not destined to continue living, then memorize our actions, our names and our pictures, and write on our graves in bold script. Here lie those who loved life and could not find a way to live it. And let us today cultivate the seeds that we've been cultivating for so long of a life where they could live, where we could all live. Again, all of us or none of us. Thank you.
I just want to kind of keep going and ask, Noura, when you speak, I think for every single one of us, and for those of us who study these things, for those of us who love those who live this, they resonate in ways that are entirely not intellectual. Yeah. They hit us. Yeah. They are questions of our souls. Yeah. And so I want to ask Marc and Nick to kind of talk us through your connection. And we're talking about Blackness, indigeneity, we're talking about different communities of struggle. Can you talk about that connection? Like when we hear these things, the way it resonates is so much deeper than the news, or and so maybe Marc, maybe you can talk us through your connection and then your entryway into the Palestinian struggle, and how you navigate that, and then also Nick.
Thank you. First, thank you for inviting me, and
thank you for being here.
Yeah, of course, thank you all for being here and being so generous. As Noura talks, I'm fighting to not cry. I mean, it's
I think we all are.
yeah, it's overwhelming. depressing, stunning. But still, there's something empowering about this moment for me as I sit here and look around this room and watch a global community bear witness to something that Palestinians have been saying forever. We can no longer pretend that it's not happening. We can no longer avoid it. We can no longer deny it. It's staring us in the face. We can make a decision about how we're going to respond to it, how we're going to make sense of it. But every single day, Palestinians are dying. Noura talked about this idea of but Hamas, right? That Hamas becomes, and the elimination of Hamas becomes the primary mechanism, both as a rhetorical device and as a strategic sort of pretext to say we're going to go there, we're going to get Hamas, and then it'll be over. For every Hamas fighter that has been killed, 2 Palestinian civilians have been killed. That's a conservative estimate. That's when you don't count who's under the rubble. That's when you don't count. That's when you assume that Israel is overstating how many fighters they've killed because their mission hasn't been successful to that extent, to the extent that they say it is. This is not about eliminating Hamas. This is about ethnic cleansing. And in legal, because ethnic cleansing isn't really like there's a better juridical frame, which would be genocide. This is a genocide. And there's just no mistaking that. And when I see this, whether or not I am invested in Palestinian freedom struggles, I can't see babies who are premature, who needed to be hooked to machines. I had a premature baby last year. He was born at 30 weeks. And I honestly can't imagine what it would mean to have my baby hooked to a machine and be told that we're going to no longer provide power to that machine to fight a mysterious enemy who we deem uncivilized and barbaric. What is more uncivilized and barbaric than unplugging machines and denying electricity and fuel and food and shelter? What is more barbaric than bombing a hospital? And so my connection to Palestine, I think, is there, but for me, it's just at the basic human level, this is a moral atrocity. But I first became connected to this work as someone who was studying Black radical traditions, Black nationalism, Black anti-capitalist movements, Black communist movements, Black socialist movements. You know, I grew up studying stuff. My first entry point was Malcolm X. And I know we'll talk later probably about that, but after I studied Malcolm, I wanted to do several things. But one of those things was to understand the world in a global context. To understand myself not just as a Black person in America, but as a Black person who was part of a broader community. As a Muslim, it meant we were part of a global ummah. As a Black person, in a Pan-African perspective, it meant that Black folk were everywhere, right? And that we'd imagine ourselves as part of a broader movement and tradition. But it also meant that the systems of oppression, the forces of oppression, the mechanisms of oppression, the levers of oppression that were exacted upon us as Black folk in America were also distributed around the globe. And so I no longer thought about frameworks of oppression within the narrow framework of the nation state. I didn't think about capitalism in the United States or white supremacy in the United States. I started thinking about this thing globally. Right. And also, as an anthropologist, and someone who cared about Africana studies, was deeply invested in the location of Black people around the world. Where were we, and what did it mean to be quote unquote Black in all these different places? And I was also an activist. So all this stuff converged in 2015 when I went to Palestine. This is the January after Ferguson summer, the much celebrated Ferguson summer, where we were in the streets marching after the execution, the lynching of Mike Brown. And we were marching and we were protesting, and much has been written about this, and to some extent romanticized, but we were marching in the streets, but there are many Palestinians there with us. And there are many people marching against state violence and speaking out against state violence and helping us think about state violence in different ways. And that same summer was Operation Protective Edge, which was a 51-day bombardment and complete attack on the Palestinian people. Sadly, what the Israeli government refers to as mowing the lawn. That every few years there is going to be a violent, destructive military action in Gaza as a way of maintaining effective control and occupation over the region, but also as another form of genocide. Despite what they tell you, it doesn't matter if the population grows or not. It doesn't matter. The raw demographic numbers don't matter. Numbers can go up, but it'd still be a genocide. The fact that they are targeting a specific group of people, part or whole, as Noura talking about, right? The fact that they're targeting Palestinian people in an area, in Gaza, and undermining their life chances, destroying them, killing them, etc., is what makes it a genocide. And so all this was happening in summer 2014, and at the same time, there were these interesting connections and organizing tactics and tips that the Palestinians were sharing with black folk in the States. And so we became more and more interested in that, and I went with a group of black activists and organizers to Ferguson, to Palestine in January of 2015, after spending considerable time in Ferguson in the summer and in November. And I'll tell you just one quick story, then I'll let it go. When I got there, one of the first people I saw was in Jerusalem. I was going through Bab el-Amoud, and as I was entering Damascus Gate, I saw a man who has become a dear friend of mine, Ali Jeddah, who's an Afro-Palestinian. And so I became extremely interested in the Afro-descendant population in all of historic Palestine. So I spent time there, I ended up doing an ethnographic project there, ended up studying this community. And I went in with a very American-centered racial framework. I went in wondering, well, if Palestinians get treated like this, how the hell do black people get treated? Like, damn, right? This is how I thought about it. And after spending considerable time there and talking to Noura and other people who taught me so much about this issue, there was a moment where I got it. And I think the moment where I got it, and I'll tell you what it is, was when I was coming back from the Dead Sea. And I had Ali with me, and I had two young men with me who were also from the Afro-Palestinian community, and we were approaching a checkpoint. There's always a checkpoint. Today was a flying checkpoint. It was a makeshift checkpoint. There's always a reason to have a new checkpoint. Right? And there was an Ethiopian soldier, someone from Beit Israel, at the checkpoint. And I said to them, I was driving, because I had the American passport, I was the safest bet, right? And I turned to them and I said, ooh, at least he's black. And the three of them, I learned a whole lot of new words. But they very gently, but thoroughly explained to me that that Ethiopian soldier was not likely to be any more merciful to them or generous to them. He didn't say that race didn't matter, right? And that's a longer conversation to have. But it was at that moment that I understood that the fact that they were Israeli soldiers was the primary thing. To use Ruth Wilson Gilmore's language, the thing that consigned them and made them vulnerable to premature death was not their blackness in that moment, it was their Palestinianness. And in that context, I came to understand how we can understand the Palestinian struggle as an anti-racist struggle, because it is. It's also an anti-colonial struggle, which it is. But we have to reimagine the terms of it. And it was at that moment that I kind of got that being Palestinian in that context is to be vulnerable to premature death exclusively, or at least primarily, because you are Palestinian. And I began to unpack that more and more. But over time, I also developed friendships and relationships. We were in Palestine one time. We went to Ali's house, right? Yeah, and I got to know these folk. And so as I'm watching this stuff happen, I'm calling my friends in Jerusalem who are also catching hell, and they're feeling guilty about feeling bad about their condition, because like it's nothing like what's going on in Gaza. So how can I even feel bad about the fact that there's a pogrom happening in Hawara? How can I feel bad about people getting shot down in Jenin? How can I feel bad about what's happening right here in the old city because of what's happening over there? And I'm checking on them, and I'm checking on the two youth who were in the back seat when we went to the Dead Sea, and they're both incarcerated. They're both incarcerated on administrative detention right now because of clashes. That's the magic word. Clashes with settlers. And so, at the emotional level, I'm overwhelmed. But what can I say, right? All I can do is check on Palestinian folk and hope that they're doing better. At the intellectual level, I'm trying to unpack this, and as somebody who cares about freedom, as everyone in this room does, I am not surprised at the world's response, because if the response were any different, we wouldn't be where we are. But to watch every single day, day 62, we just said, right? Day 62. On day 62, to watch Palestinian people be killed every single day, and to still hear the language of barbarism. They're barbaric, they're uncivilized, they're not human. And they ain't talking about the people who are killing the babies. They're talking about the babies. It's unimaginable to me to watch and the last thing I'm going to say, to watch a congressional hearing where we're talking about everything but the actual thing. We're literally grilling this black woman at Harvard. Right? Elise Stefanik, who has done more to advance anti-Semitism with replacement theories, and I mean, we're going down a list of stuff, right? Literally holding space for anti-Semitism at the same time that she's trying to convince this black woman that she's not fit for her job, right? This MAGA elected congresswoman, right? If anything destroys the myth of white supremacy, it's people like her, right? When you have her trying to tell this black woman that somehow she supports genocide, simply because she does not want to concede that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, that critiques of Israel are anti-Semitic, that saying river to the sea or intifada is a call to because she's not willing to concede that ground politically, ideologically, or rhetorically, they're somehow trying to box her into a corner and say that she's anti-Semitic. Yeah. I mean, this is the world we're in, and so for me, it's anyway. I don't even know how to wind it down, but just I'm very frustrated.
No, and just for those of you, Mark is referring to the congressional hearings that took place yesterday, in which university presidents were being grilled by a MAGA Republican, Elise Stefanik from New York, I believe, who was charging that certain type of language that student activists were using on campus, intifada from the river to the sea, constituted calls for genocide, and trying to make these university presidents state that. Anyways, you can watch it for yourselves. So anyways, I want to thank you so much, Mark, and I want to turn to you. I mean, from what Mark is saying, and there are these kind of ways that we connect to this struggle, like just purely through humanity, right? But there are also these specificities, thinking about blackness, thinking about indigeneity in these different contexts. Right, and so I wonder if you can kind of connect some of your work, amazing work, thinking about Standing Rock. You talk about connecting with Palestinian activists at Standing Rock. I wonder if you can talk through kind of, like Mark, your entryway and kind of building those connections and how you see how we can connect those struggles in our work and how we think through this moment.
Kamitaki api, nape chuzapi chante washte. Just greetings to everyone. I couldn't find this building. And I was actually looking for like protesters or something. I was waiting to be greeted by your congressman, lovely man. Wrote a really lovely review about me. But I was sitting there thinking about this, and when I was coming to the East Coast and how much different it is from different parts of the country, for a variety of reasons. And I think for me, though, having studied in New England, it's the utter erasure of indigeneity. That is probably one of the most primary, that's like what all Stephen King's novels take place in New England, right? It's this like repressed settler colonial genocide that's actually the true horror of this country, that it's never willing to confront, but it's willing to be entertained by. And so thinking about that in terms of like what Rutgers, I was like, actually, you know what? Rutgers owes me something. So you can follow me along on this. Go on your smartphone, type in landgrabu.org and look up your university. And look up where your university has land grants. Your university has land grants in my territory, Ochete Shalkoni territory, that were granted to this university to be sold as capital, to go into your capital funds at the expense of my people not only being removed from that land, but being genocided from that land. That was in 1862. 208,000 acres of territory. That's twice the size of my reservation, to put that into context. So just thinking about that, like we often think of settler colonialism, especially when it pertains to the United States, as something that happened in the past. If it is, something that happened in the past, then give us the land back, or we'll pay you what your ancestors paid for that land, and we'll call it a square deal, right? And I think about that in terms of the context that we're currently, facing. I was actually with Noura in San Francisco on October 7th. We were speaking with a group of nurses at a nurses union, actually, and the tragedy happened on October 6th. The tragedy happened on October 4th. It happened before October 7th. It happened after October 7th. And I think about that in the context of what Noura just said. And I think about it in terms of the work that I've done as a historian in addressing things such as boarding schools, the theft of children over a century and a half that the United States government is actually willing to admit to. That just came out 2 years ago through the federal government. They finally admitted that they had over 400 federal institutions dedicated solely to removing Native children all across the country, all into Alaska, all across the Pacific, dedicated solely to removing Native children from their families. Hundreds, if not thousands of them were killed there. Go to Carlisle Barracks. It's currently the oldest military installation in this country. When you enter the campus, there are 200 or so headstones. Looks like you're entering a military, veterans memorial or cemetery, but in fact, those are Native children who died at that school. Half the incoming class in 1879 died at that school. Half the class. It's almost a travesty to even call it a school. What kind of school kills half of its incoming class? But it was transformed from a military barracks into a school by military personnel, managed by the Department of Interior. And I remember speaking with an elder and a tribal historic preservation officer from the Rosebud Reservation named Ben Rod, who told me there are 4 things that are the worst things that can happen to a Lakota person. The first and the worst thing to ever happen to you is to lose a child. The second is to lose a comrade in arms and not know where their body is. The third is to lose your mother. And the fourth is to lose your father. I don't think those are Lakota specific values, but I think about how the stealing away of children has reverberated from generations. This isn't even a new thing, by the way. My dad went to boarding school. He was sent to boarding school. It's not like something that happened in the 19th century. And generations of Native people are still recovering from that trauma. The loss of language, the loss of kinship ties, the loss of family, because we often think of genocide and settler colonialism as sort of these monumental, spectacular moments. But in fact, it's the things that happen over generation that make them the most dangerous and nefarious. And thinking about that in the context of what Noura shared with us, of all those families carrying their children's body parts into hospitals, day after day after day, not knowing where their loved ones are, buried under rubble, right? But this was when we go back to thinking about intent and the concept of genocide, and I almost want to take that international framework and just throw it in the garbage, because we have our own conceptions of what genocide is and what destruction and an apocalypse is, and we should ground it within our own values, not just as Lakota people, not just as Palestinians, not just as Black people, but as human beings. Because we have to understand that genocide, first and foremost, is about severing relations. It's about severing relations to the land. It's about severing relations to history. It's about severing relations to our own families. It's about severing relations to a future. Why else would you kill children other than to just take away and steal the future? And I think about this in the context of the current climate catastrophe that we're facing. At COP28, what dominated the discussions? It wasn't climate change, it was Palestine. And thank God it was Palestine, because it showed the clear divisions of humanity in this world. It showed why we cannot have just transition in this world. Because a minority of humanity, of the countries that live with relative, freedom from violence, and those who they perpetrate that violence upon are in different camps, fundamentally. They have different competing visions. There's a side of the billions and then there's a side of the millions. And thank God that was the dividing line, because it created the necessary ruptures that we needed in the climate movement. To say that decolonization is not something, it's not a DEI initiative. It's not the D in DEI. But it's decolonization or extinction at this point, both for Palestine and Gaza, but also for this planet. And I have more to say, but I'll just leave it there.
Thank you so much to all of you. I think so much of the work right now of this minute this moment is to think about the vocabulary that all of you have been using, and that so many of us in this room are kind of grappling with. Decolonization, occupation, settler colonialism, anti-blackness, racism, right? And so I'm wondering, I think for so many of us, looking at, listening, and being in relation with all of you is trying to think about how we can create a vocabulary and a relation together through all of our struggles intertwined with Palestine as the catalyst in this moment to find that future, to connect us to that. So I wonder, maybe Noura, I know that, you talked about it during Ferguson, Palestinian activists reached out to activists. And those connections are showing up. Palestinians were at Standing Rock. Those connections are showing up right now. So I wonder if you can speak to the ways, this is not just work that is happening, you three are not just building this, you've been doing this work. So I wonder if you can tell us how it is showing up and how we can keep it going, right? Like the different networks, the different connections. What does it look like on the ground to make these connections, and the work that you've been doing to find this space for us now?
I heard two. I'm such a nerd. I heard two questions.
Yeah, there's probably like 8 questions.
So can
in
I
there.
answer both of them?
Yeah, answer all of them.
Okay, I'm going to answer both of them. I heard a first question about vocabulary and what we use.
Yes,
which I think is
vocabulary.
very pertinent. And I also heard a question about solidarity, right? So I'm going to answer the first one first. I'm going to start by saying that I wasn't asked how is it that I come, to embrace Black liberation struggle as my struggle. How is it that I come to embrace indigenous liberation and restoration of sovereignty as my struggle and identify as a settler, right, here on these lands. And so I have an entry point too. So much of it, it starts from me as a child, and I knew myself in the world. The first way that I knew myself in the world was as a girl. Before I knew that I was a Palestinian, before I knew I was Muslim, before I knew I was a settler, or right, and living in a structure of white supremacy, I knew I lived in a structure of patriarchy, and that I was a feminist, even though I didn't have the language for feminism.
Come on.
At 9 years old, that was a little hard. But I did know that there were certain things that were told to me as a 9-year-old that didn't make any sense about the distribution of chores and privileges, right? About in the home, and about the way that God made us this way. And I thought, there is no way that I was born like this, because I have a lot more skills than they're not in the kitchen, right? Don't say And so, that becomes my lens to see the world. And so I understood at a very young age about, this unfairness. When I traveled to Palestine, my first time by myself, without my parents, right, at 14, It's the way that I understand the de-development between my village of Abu Dis and then the way that Jerusalem, which Abu Dis is a suburb of, is highly developed. Either I was going to believe people who years later, like John Kerry, was going to say that we just weren't smart enough or hardworking enough, right, to develop Abu Dis, or in fact, there were certain structures that prevented us from developing, and in fact, our dispossession was enriching somebody else. And that's more or less how I understood and come into solidarity with all peoples. When I was young, I wanted to become, this is before Madeleine Albright killed it for everybody, I wanted to become the first woman Secretary of State before I also understood the U.S. was an empire. I realized I didn't want anything to do with that. But, you know, I remember my family would ask me, why not work on Palestine or on Muslim issues or whatnot? And I thought, because I'm a human. And I want to be out here for humans, right? All that to say that I did, and I think that's the way most of us enter into solidarity. Solidarity is often through what I describe as a structure of intimacy and a feeling. But I didn't begin my study, formal study of it, probably until 2014. In the crucible of the Ferguson summer, in the consecutive, bombardment of the Gaza Strip, at which point it wasn't enough just to understand what we're doing together, but to understand what are the racial structures that explain this moment. And that began my formal study, and why now it constitutes a big part of my research, right? And in that, obviously there's no way to discuss, to study race without studying settler colonialism. And so in that, I think what a lot of us tend to do often, and Professor McDasher reminds us of this too, even in the land acknowledgements, there's a caricaturing of our indigenous kin that makes them the static object or somehow relegated to the past, and not in the form of an ongoing dispossession of what I would call genocidal expansion and territorial consolidation that Nick articulated for us. And so there, in that study, my first teachers are Black feminists who are forwarding all sorts of language for us, all sorts of nuance and complexity that forces us not to see the world in simple ways, but to grapple with them. And so I want to read you actually something. I actually brought a book. You mentioned your Ruth Wilson Gilmore. I'm a professor at Rutgers. I teach nothing on Palestine. I don't have any formal classes on that. I teach race, law, da-da-da-da. But I teach Palestine every day somehow. Every day somehow. And yesterday, as we were closing out a class on the carceral state and the construction of race, because race is not real. Race is a construction.
Right.
It is not a fact. But racism is real. And racists are real, right? And so how do we study that? We end with Ruthie Wilson Gilmore in her conclusion. And I found myself, because one of the things that's been asked of me and that Marc raised, I guess I'm not going to get a lot into solidarity, we'll do that later, because this is long. But one of the things that Marc raised about, Palestine as an anti-racist struggle. As we're doing this work and wanting to articulate that, there's been so much pushback from people who feel like racism isn't bad enough to encompass what's happening to Palestinians. In a way that signifies a misunderstanding of racism and a horrible misunderstanding of Black liberation struggle in the United States, and even a historical misunderstanding of the South African freedom struggle. Apartheid in South Africa is a colonial structure. Apartheid, as designated in ~65 in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, understands it as a colonial racial structure, right? And South African activists understood it as a peculiar kind of colonialism, right? Even though today it's understood as a peculiar kind of racism. In '73, when it's consecrated as a crime against humanity, it's understood as being tied to the land and the displacement of an indigenous people. Boer Afrikaners explicitly said that they fought a liberation struggle against the British, and this was a land without a people for a people without the land in South Africa. And yet today, historically, we recognize it as, we celebrate it in a revisionist history of integration and civil rights in the South African context. That was an anti-colonial struggle. We're in an anti-colonial struggle. Racism cannot be severed from colonialism. Genocide is not possible without racism.
Yes.
And the thorough dehumanization of people, right? And so to all those who, had a thing to say about the apartheid finding on Palestine, y'all said it didn't exist then, but we know full well racism exists. So let me just read you this definition in this lesson I apparently gave on Palestine even as we were talking about the US, okay? Citing specifically what you said. In her 10 theses, where do we go from here? Thesis number 9. Racism is the scale, sanctioned, and or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death, right? It is the way that we make that death common sense. However, a few pages earlier, she explains to us very chillingly and reminds us of our common human condition, that genocide, that the 20th century was the age of genocide on a planetary scale. That in order to avoid repeating history, we ought to prioritize coming to grips with dehumanization. Dehumanization names the deliberate as well as the mob frenzy, ideological displacements central to any group's ability to annihilate an other in the name of territory, wealth, ethnicity, religion. And she ties that to conditions of the carceral state, that dehumanization is also a necessary factor in the acceptance that millions of people, sometimes including oneself, should spend part or all of their lives in cages. So that here, I want to just emphasize that my short answer to you is that even saying racial colonialism is redundant, because racism is a structure that continues a colonial project, and colonialism is impossible without this thorough dehumanization that justifies it.
I just want to add to the brilliant work of Ruthie, Rutgers alum, by the way, that she also ties all of this into a larger structure of racial capitalism as well, in which we understand that there are people profiting from this situation right now. We understand that that is a necessary fuel for why certain weapons have to be sold to certain parties, and they are, the machine is working the way it's supposed to be working, right? Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, I think that's why that vocabulary is so necessary, even of racial capitalism, right? I mean, the Black radical tradition was incredibly helpful in helping us think about racial capitalism in interesting ways. South Africa becomes one entry point into racial capitalism. Cedric Robinson becomes another entry point to the conversation about racial capitalism. But I think Cedric Robinson's point, when he begins to unpack racial capitalism, is that all capitalism is racial capitalism, right? This isn't a particular quirk of the United States or of South Africa or of any other place, but that the contradictions of capitalism can only sort of function, and the expansion of the capitalist state can only function by racializing a particular body of people. And that language has been helpful to help us think about the United States in process of racialization, whether it's obviously Black folk, right? Whether we're talking about ethnic Eastern European folk. I mean, there are these various moments in the United States where the project of racialization is critical for justifying the exploitation and, more importantly, the extraction of labor, of resources, etc., from this land, from these people. Because as we racialize them, we also justify their dehumanization. They aren't people. They aren't people. And I think that same language is useful as we think about Palestine, as is the language of carcerality. I mean, it's not just a sort of interesting symbolic gesture to call Gaza an open-air prison. Gaza is an actual carceral space. People cannot leave. People cannot come in. It's carceral because it's a structure of human confinement marked by coercion, control, and criminalization. That is what Gaza is. It is a carceral space. And so as we think about carceral in the logic of the prison industrial complex, that's helpful, but Gaza also becomes another space to think about that. And so as we think about abolition, it's not just about getting rid of the prison industrial complex. It's about thinking about Gaza, but even the prison industrial complex and even the prison itself is an artifact of capitalism and the racialization of folk, which is how you end up going from a tradition of enslaving Africans to a tradition of incarcerating Africans, right? The reason I'm bringing that up is because it's also helpful to think about the formation of the Israeli state. Okay? It begins from a project of rejecting a certain kind of racialization in Europe, and Noura's work speaks to this incredibly helpfully in the Harvard Law Review, is that right? Harvard something? Harvard something, just know it's fancy. But this idea of thinking about the formation of the Israeli state as a way for the Zionist movement itself to engage in a certain kind of construction of an identity bound up in whiteness. Or you can't be white in Europe, but as you form this new nation state, you can be, right? And you think about the structures that allow for the racialization of folk in the context of Israel is what? Things like the Jewish National Fund, right? I mean, there are actual economic structures and formations that allowed the Zionist movement to be successful, right? It's an economic process that's bound up in the racialization and the construction of an other. In the context of the Jewish ethno-state, the other is the Palestinian. But it also plays out in other ways inside of the Israeli state, right? In terms of the Ashkenazim versus the Sephardim, or the Mizraim, or the Beit Yisrael, the Ethiopian Jew, or whomever, right? We can get more down in the weeds if you think about some of the Hebrew Israelites who came over. But the idea here is that there are lots of traditions and ways that this state is bound up in the extraction of resources, right? Because as the Zionist movement is occurring and expanding, it's occurring by controlling and quarantining resources from the indigenous Palestinian population and justifying it by saying they are not the other, or they are the other rather. Excuse me, and it's done under the imprimatur of a colonial. Of a colonial empire, the British, which makes it settler colonial. So all these frameworks, settler colonialism, racial capitalism, all these things are useful frameworks. They're not exhaustive. They're tools that we can use, but they're helpful tools that help us make sense of what's going on. And I think there was a moment where people would say, "Oh, you're calling it settler colonial. That's anti-Semitic. You're calling it racial capitalism. That's inappropriate. You're saying that it's racist. It's underwhelming as an analytic." Like there are people who are saying these things don't fully capture. In some ways, they don't. But if we really read carefully and closely and study history, we understand that that's exactly what's happening in lots of cases.
I want to be mindful of time because I know we started late and it's 6 o'clock now, but I was wondering, have folks passed out the index cards? Yeah, I'm going to open it up for reading your questions in just a moment. We could listen to them. I know we could listen to them all day, so I hope everyone's okay with staying over time. That's okay. So
I can answer your question, Cynthia.
oh yeah, no, and I want Nick to questions of solidarity and vocabulary.
You asked it as the first question, and I didn't answer it.
Oh,
and you
okay.
asked it again, so I'll answer it again.
Okay.
I'll answer it this time. But yeah, so Standing Rock was an interesting sort of entry point into solidarity for a variety of reasons. One, I just being on the ground, it's like we have really great theories and concepts, but it's much different to participate into something. That's actually where theory is made. Revolutionary theory is made through movements. It's not made by people like me. But I was on the ground and we were just building a cook shack. That was like the first task. It wasn't like, all the pictures you saw where we're getting tear gassed or pepper sprayed or shot with rubber bullets. I mean, that happened, but it wasn't like the everyday event. Oftentimes we would just hang out and like meet and share meals. And today we were building a cook shack. And I noticed, and I always forget his name, who's the Palestinian artist that's very famous with the BDS logo?
Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, alhamdulillah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a brother wearing a alhamdulillah shirt, and I said, hey, I like that, like your shirt. And he said, oh, I'm Palestinian. My name is Ahmad. I'm from Yankton. And I saw, and I decided to come, and those sorts of connections. He wasn't part of an organization. He wasn't, part of anything. He saw Intifada and he recognized it, right? Because that's what it was. That's what my Palestinian comrade, Samia said. She said, this is an Intifada on the plains. And this is what you're doing. You're not just rebelling, you're creating a new world. So you saw those connections, and the police that were there, the 92 different law enforcement jurisdictions that were there, also saw those connections. And it was evident in the, the leaked documents from Tiger Swan, which is a private security company that cut its teeth on, being deployed in the U.S. War on terror in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. So bringing that sort of thing, those sort of tactics home, those counterinsurgency tactics home, calling this a jihadi-inspired, that's a direct quotation, uprising, because every day there would be prayer, right? Apparently people praying, not in a Christian faith, makes you a jihadist. And there's no denigration to that term either. That's a term that's been completely bastardized within the Western lexicon and distorted. But they were using it to frame us as another, right? Anyone who came, they were noting the black activists from national organizations who were showing up, the presence of Palestinian activists. They had their names. They knew which organization they were from. They knew when they showed up to camp. They knew when they left. And they were also circulating videos, YouTube videos, of IDF soldiers crushing youth-led uprisings in the West Bank. And were particularly taken by skunk spray. There's a whole email thread about skunk spray. And does anybody know what skunk spray is? It's a chemical that it's a really disgusting chemical. They spray it on you. It's not something that you can easily wash off. And it's almost like a form of torture, right? When you get hit by it. And that's what they were that's what they suggested be used on water protectors. They used something else. They used urine. When they raided the 1851 treaty camp, when they returned the items, our eagle staffs, all of our secret ceremonial items, our teepees, our tents, clothes, before they returned them, they urinated on them. And I had to testify about. I got a federal subpoena. I had to testify about this in court. So if I lie now, then they're gonna arrest me for perjury. But I was there when it happened, and I remember sitting there thinking, like, what is that smell? But it was that level of hatred towards what was happening there. So when we think about these connections, I actually learned about Palestine. I mean, I knew about Palestine when I was in high school. I read Chomsky's Fateful Triangle, and I knew about it in an abstract sense, but I actually learned it during Black Lives Matter. I learned it from my Black comrades. I learned about how to incorporate it into our thinking and our action and our study. And I learned about it by asking questions of my elders who were part of the Red Power movement, who were part of the American Indian movement, who had gone to Lebanon when the PLO's headquarters were there in Lebanon and met with the resistance movement to have cultural exchanges. They brought youth groups there. They brought Native women's organizations there, because they recognized in Palestine an unrecognized nation of the world that was striving for liberation and to get their land back. And they were actually saying land back. I have a transcript of one of the American Indian Movement elders, or he's the elder now, John Thomas. He was in Tehran, and he actually says during, after they took over the embassy, he was saying outside of Tehran, he said, I'm here because, we as oppressed people of the Western Hemisphere want our land back. That's what he says. So they saw themselves as part of a global movement for liberation. They imagined our struggles beyond the sort of confines of the nation state, thinking beyond sort of just crying on the shoulder of the man who stole your land and asking for it back. The horizon of struggle was liberation. And of course, and I think what's more instructive actually about this particular story and the experiences that these elders shared about how close Palestine was to their hearts and their thinking is where we are today with our movements, and where we are with the fact that all of our native elected officials in Congress right now are not just kind of Zionist, they're very Zionist. Look at how they vote. Look at how AIPAC promotes them, and how they have distorted our own identity as not just Native people, but our own history as a national liberation movement. I know that word's kind of like it's out of style, but it was at that time what they believed that they were doing, and how they've aligned it with a settler colonial project. It's a complete distortion. And so one of the things that I think we have to do is not to just go back and romanticize the past, but to look that those connections were real. And I want to read you something that was posted by one of these Red Power organizations. It was the Third World People's Coalition, and it was created by the Native Study Group, which was based out of Vancouver in British Columbia, so-called British Columbia. And it was entitled, Palestinians and Natives Are Brothers, sick. Some notes on why Native people should support national liberation movements of the Third World. And this is a paragraph that stands out. The extent to which we as Native people are moved to indignation by the crimes historically perpetrated against the Palestinian people and other oppressed peoples in the Third World is the extent to which we have not been successfully integrated into a parasitic and oppressive culture. The extent to which we can be stirred by their heroic struggles to liberate their peoples is the extent to which our history of resistance has not lost its continuity. That was written in 1974.
Wow. So I'm going to ask one last question. I myself had 7 questions that I didn't ask, so I just want to apologize in advance if we don't get to everyone's questions in the room. But we are here to talk about what is happening in Palestine, and we've talked about race, and so I want to end with the word liberation that is in our title. One of the things that Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who I was privileged to have as a teacher and a mentor during my graduate studies, one thing that she talked about a lot was utopian visions. She talked about the ways in which we have to imagine a future to work towards it. So in this moment of grief, of horror, of tragedy, I actually want to ask you about utopia, which might seem strange. As Marian Kaba says, we have to envision the world that we want to live in. So to end, I want to ask, how do each of you see liberation as something that is possible for us? And as Angela Davis says, Palestine opens up this capacious vision for us to think about what liberation is. And so, in closing, I'd love to hear what that liberation looks like for each of you.
I've started every time, so I'm gonna cede the floor.
Okay, I'll say this. When I think about liberation, I think we have to sort of, especially everybody want to go to heaven, don't nobody want to die. If we want to be free and we want to imagine liberation, we can't imagine abolition without dismantling capitalism. Right? Similarly, I can't imagine a free Palestine without also reimagining what our vision of liberation. I think about Adam Katatsu and this idea of saying instead of nation building, we should be thinking about world making. Right? So we can't get free, but even the concepts of one state, two state solution, all the kind of political dialogue. There's a space to have that conversation, but ultimately, as long as we're indebted to the nation state as an idea, we're always going to be indebted to structures of violence and containment and racialization and exclusion and extraction. And so we have to. I don't know what the answer is, but I know whatever vision of liberation we have lives outside the nation state. It lives outside the capitalism.
Yeah, I prefer the concept of a horizon of struggle because you can never get to the end. It's not a destination, it's just something that you keep striving for. And I think of all the people that have been named, the scholars, revolutionaries of the past are all like our ancestors. Even to quote what Ruthie Gilmore talks about in structure, what does she call it? She calls it not structures of feeling. I can't remember what it's called, but it's not in that book. It's in a different one. But she creates this this concept of a tradition, right? The radical tradition, that we're constantly selecting and reselecting our ancestors, for whatever reason, because tradition is often like seen as a conservative, practice, right? That we inherit things that are unchanging. but she thinks of it in a very capacious way in how we select and reselect our ancestors. And there's an indigenous tradition, there's a black radical tradition, there's a Palestinian resistance tradition, but then there's, I think, traditions that overlap in ways that you shouldn't really distinguish, that I would consider some Palestinian friends and comrades and thinkers of mine as part of the Native liberation tradition. Same with the black radical tradition. I wouldn't be here today had I not read Cedric Robinson, had I not read, Malcolm X, the autobiography of Malcolm X. I read that as a kid, I even asked my mom, I said, Mom, are we black? Because I didn't know. Because I was convinced that I experienced, And so this was a thing that I saw something in his writing, right? And I think about this in terms of how we articulate a vision of freedom, right? Because we know that when we say things like land back, when we say things like decolonization, it's an immediate projection onto us, what the colonizer did to us, that we're somehow going to do to them. Oh, you want land back? What about all these settlers? What are we going to do with them? Oh, you want from the river to the sea? What about, Jewish people in Israel? And because their imagination, their projection, their idea is a zero-sum game of elimination and genocide. That's a you problem, not a me problem. And this is, it doesn't really answer the question of what does liberation look like. And I think what it's important to point out, as like Marc just said, is like what it doesn't look like. It doesn't look like getting trapped in these games. They're settler games, right? Settlers, no matter where they are, they always call us assimilated. Oh, we sent you to boarding school, you're speaking English. Like we taught you how to, drive a car, all these things. It's like, bro, you're assimilated, man. You're the most assimilated person because you can't imagine an alternative to this. And I think that's where this conversation has to start. It's not, yes, there is a physical decolonization that has to take place. We saw in the city that I live in that the 3rd precinct had to burn, right? It had to burn. It has a higher approval rating. The burning of the 3rd precinct has a higher approval rating than Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Let's just be honest. That was something that the community decided was no longer useful for them and they had to burn it. But also the question is, what are we actually building, right? What does that world look like? And we can't have that conversation in silos, and it can't be just reproducing the sort of confines and the limitations of the nation state, as basically just reiterated what Marc just said.
That's the best part.
It's the liberation.
That's the best part, is the liberation piece. So I'm also going to echo this as well. I'm going to echo this as well and echo the idea of world making and where do we go from here and begin, right? Also begin in this tradition of something that I've shared and come to a conclusion after, in the process of writing my own book, right? At the end of it, I was stuck with this idea of I can't believe I spent all these years and all I'm going to come up with for Palestine is the 3 propositions they had at the UN Special Committee on Palestine in 1947. A single state, binational state or 2 states, that doesn't make sense. That's not right. And it was a sister of mine who asked me to take a break to read some Afrofuturism, which I thought was really annoying because I was stressed about deadlines and thought that's not what we're doing here. And yet I was reading Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler at the time. And woke up and had this epiphany of sorts of thinking, oh my God, that's right, our history is the future, right? Our history is the future in the sense that, the return of Palestinian refugees to their original homes and their lands is not the culmination of Palestinian freedom struggle. It is the beginning of it. Because that is precisely the moment where we have to imagine how it is that we've created a new world for everybody, right? Because even for those Palestinians, right, who might be even of the generation of the Nakba, which should be entered into our lexicon and our language, right, they're not even going back to something. If they were a family of 7, they're probably now a family of 35, right? The idea of just returning to the past isn't even adequate for Palestinians, so how is it adequate for our future? So if we imagine that be the beginning, of our struggle. The question that I ask is, how is it that Palestinians can offer ourselves and offer Jewish Israelis a better future than Israel is offering? And Israel is offering a very, but Israel is offering a very dismal future. It sucks for everybody. For everybody. It's, garrison walls. It's more weapons. It's flying drones that come to your torch to threaten you not to resist, otherwise you will be targeted. It's the kidnapping of children and the trying them in military trials. It's building, more surveillance schemes, AI technologies to commit genocide. That's the future that they are offering. Surely our task is not that hard to imagine. What is a future where we actually understand that our existence is mutually reinforcing and not mutually exclusive? Where we shift out of this idea of merely being masters of the land instead to belong to the land, right? Which is an infinite proposition. And so here I go back to Fayez Sayegh, a Palestinian scholar who was at the forefront of passing the revolution, the resolution, which was revolutionary, in 1975, in the crucible of non-aligned movement, of third world revolt, of the understanding that this was a new world. The idea of establishing a nation state for national liberation movements, right, which proliferate in the aftermath of the Second World War, when the promise of self-determination never comes into being, a promise that's planted in the aftermath of the First World War, right? The vision of the nation state was meant to be, in the work of Adam Katachu, a predicate element to overcoming imperialism. That's a step. But unfortunately, many of these movements stopped at establishing the nation state and never moved beyond that horizon, right? So Fayez Sayegh, in this crucible, is working with a coalition of national liberation, national armed struggle, liberation movements of newly independent states to establish a decade against racism in the General Assembly, right? In order to fight against apartheid, and there proposes that Zionism be inserted into the text everywhere apartheid, colonialism, and racism appears. And we see the fractures there, right? We see the fractures there that are continuing. A world community threatening to unravel the entire struggle against racism if Palestine is not removed. And this should be an ominous warning for us all of how Palestine is used as a scapegoat in order to prevent all of our liberation and collective movements. Oftentimes through the back door, oftentimes through the front door, right? Of using it in that way. But there we understood Zionism as a racial project and a colonial project, and if we understand it as such, what is the offering in understanding Palestine as a continuing anti-racist project, right? Where all of us are in struggle against white supremacy, including Jews who continue to struggle against white supremacy, which has marked them for exclusion and removal and eugenicist programming, social programming and elimination, right? What does that struggle for us look like? So my horizon for liberation is a Palestine that offers an answer to the world, is a place for all refugees, not just Palestinian refugees, is a model. Yeah. And so we don't end there, we begin there.
Thank you for those beautiful visions, for the beautiful words. I have like 25 questions here, and I've been trying to read through them really quickly. And there's some sentiments that kind of rise to the top, and I know this is what we're feeling together in this room right now. And I wanted to ask this question because, Noura, you just talked about, kind of thinking about anti-Semitism, and that it is also racism. We have to understand that this is a form of white supremacist, kind of violence that we are also dealing with in this moment. And so there are questions, I asked this in care and carefully. Genocide is severing relations in this moment, and on our campuses we are having this severing of relation between students who are feeling fear, anti-Semitism that is being directed at certain students in the midst of Palestinian genocide. So I wonder how all of you can respond to a number of the questions that are asking about how do we approach questions of anti-Semitism on campus, beyond, in our present moment, in our movements, as a means to finding that relationality, that solidarity. How do you think about the question of anti-Semitism, the definitions that are being used? How do we navigate this to kind of find collectivity and solidarity in this moment?
I think first we have to have a conversation about what anti-Semitism is and what anti-Semitism is not. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism has become a tool used by organizations like the ADL, AIPAC, etc., to define anti-Semitism so broadly that it not only includes hatred of Jewish people for being Jewish and violence against Jewish people for being Jewish and things that are actually anti-Semitism, but also includes it conflates, it constructs Zionism as Jewishness, right? So that any critique of Zionism is an attack on Jewishness and thereby definitionally anti-Semitic.
Right.
Any critique of Israel as the kind of full embodiment of the Zionist political imagination then becomes anti-Semitism. So you can't critique Israel, you can't critique Zionism. It also says that the IHRA definition that you can't suggest that Israel's foundation, that the formation of the Israeli state is one of the examples given, that the formation of the Israeli state being a racist endeavor is an act of anti-Semitism. So if I say that Zionism is an act of racism or a settler colonial project, that also is considered anti-Semitism. And so they've defined anti-Semitism so broadly that yes, in a congressional hearing like 2 days ago, they can say, well, yeah, it's anti-Semitism on campus, and here's the proof. People are calling for a one-state solution. And if a one-state solution means that we don't have control over historic Palestine anymore, that could lead to our demographic, a loss of demographic control. And if it's a loss of demographic control, then so now you're calling for the destruction of Jewish people. So for me, imagining a political reality of one state, which I agree is not the end game here, I'm just saying. But if we imagine just claiming that you want a one-state solution is now seen as anti-Semitism. So part of the conversation is if we concede all of that territory, then what happens is on campus we're not just addressing the actual attacks on Jewish students. We're not just attacking the anti-Semitic tropes. We're not just attacking the actual harm that's happening, the rhetorical maneuvers that are taking place. We're also smuggling in all this other stuff. So I think we have to have that conversation.
Yeah.
You know, but we also have to address the fact that Black folk and brown folk and Muslims have been constructed in such a way, and we can talk about Muslims in particular who've been racialized. You're thinking of the wonderful book, The Racial Muslim, right? Sahar Aziz's book. You know, how even the racialization of the Muslim constructs in such a way that, again, we're anti-Semitic until proven otherwise. Black folk are anti-Semitic until proven otherwise. Brown folk are anti-Semitic until proven otherwise. So then we have to ritually denounce anti-Semitism at every moment, lest we be deemed anti-Semitic. So you spend so much time doing that we actually don't have space to actually address the actual project of liberating oppressed folk, which includes Jewish people.
Yeah. Yep.
So we gotta have that conversation first.
Yeah.
Can I build on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to build on that because I think here this is the idea of how does the current framing of anti-Semitism actually strengthen and edify white supremacy, right? And I think that this is what we're pushing up against. Where in the congressional resolutions that were proposed, in fact, anti-Semitism is condemned first and foremost in the Middle East. A very odd construction following the line about a Holocaust, a Jewish Holocaust that takes place in Europe, right? There has been an outright displacement and responsibility and accountability for the ways in which white supremacy and whiteness constructs itself as a pure project that excludes Jewish people in Europe and marks them for elimination, right? By displacing it onto what other people are doing now so that there's never that accounting, right? There's never that accounting. So this goes back to what you were saying, but just to bring it forward here. Anti-Semitism is originally and should be understood as a racializing project. Jews were racialized very clearly in a eugenicist framework that also, you know, their physical features, their phenotypes that help us identify them also as a biological category, but also in very Orientalist terms that mark them as overly religious, as insular, as dirty, right? As speaking an outdated language like Yiddish. These were the terms, and then they were given the opportunity to become white through the Enlightenment framework that invited them in if they would fully assimilate. And that assimilation of Jewishness was synonymous to them basically abandoning all of that religion for them becomes a private affair, right? But it was never an idea of pluralism, but always the construction of the Jew as outside, right? Hence, political Zionism, which establishes a Jewish state, right, outside of Europe's shores, was a bid to earn acceptance within Europe. If they were no longer identified as not having a nation, right? That this would be, but that project is predicated on the ongoing removal of Palestinians and their dispossession. And so what we are being told right now is that if we oppose that, right, if we oppose that construction, then we are actually anti-Semitic, when in fact all we are is against white supremacy. That articulated that construction to begin with. You know, and more than that, just on a personal level, it means for me, I can't say I'm Palestinian because somehow now my existence is, you know, a blatant, and it is, right, a blatant resistance to Israel. As a Jewish state with a solid demographic majority predicated on my removal, dispossession, and genocide. My existence is anti-Semitic under this construction. So if we go back, we actually see that anti-Semitism was originally articulated as race, and in fact, why the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination was to be established, was to condemn anti-Jewish bigotry. That doesn't happen, that's its own history. But today we have a choice, and part of that choice is here in these institutions where we have to teach this and study it. What is anti-Semitism, right? And so in the crucible of solidarity, this is the last thing I'll say about this, between 2014 and 2018, a group of Jewish, Black, and Palestinian activists successfully abolished police training in Israel, abolished Durham Police Department training in Israel. As part of that effort, right, this was the moment of the Tiki Torch marches in Charlottesville. I mean, this is what one interlocutor told me was classic anti-Semitism, right? It's in this moment where there's a lot of fear for everyone. And so the initial reaction, but it's also in the crucible of Black uprising, right? Yeah. And so the Jewish community thought, well, we need FBI involvement to protect us, we need security gates at our synagogues, we need to arm ourselves, this is how we're going to protect ourselves. From that same synagogue, a group breaks out and says, well, if you involve the FBI, you're actually creating more harm for our Muslim kin, who are, you know, subject to entrapment and surveillance and racialization. They're dangerous until proven otherwise. And if you involve the police to be here, you're actually threatening our Black kin, who are subject to policing as a form of racial and colonial oppression and domination. So we want something else. And here we see a split. And here we see a split about what possibilities are there. Do we police and securitize ourselves in ways that divide us from one another? Or do we do what this community did, which is find safety and solidarity? They found safety and solidarity. And they abolished, they're the only municipal successful campaign that abolished their police department training in Israel, which is ongoing. I'm not sure if our police do that. We should look into it.
I want to add, the questions are about history. They are about how we confront this moment. They are about how we build solidarity. They are about international law and how we engage with that. I want to ask one, because in this room, in this space, on this college campus, I think these questions always really kind of, you know, they are what matter for us. A young student asked, what are your recommendations for undergrads and recently graduated younger people for what they can do and how they can make a difference when they feel so helpless, and how to transform that frustration into something constructive? What advice do you have for those of us who want to get involved in this type of work and building this world? And I'll end with that.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah.
jump in on this. I have one anecdote about anti-Semitism on campus that I saw. There was a group of ostensibly Jewish students having a conversation. I was riding my bike, but I overheard the conversation. I wasn't riding that fast. Not being creepy, but I was just kidding. And this student. But anyway, they were having this conversation, and one of the students said, you know, it's really like racist, it's anti-Semitism that this professor said that, and I was like, that's when I slowed down. And I was like, oh, here we go. I want to hear what this student has to say. And he said, the professor asked Jewish students how they felt in this moment. And he's like, how insulting to think that my Jewishness has anything to do with the actions of the state of Israel. He's like, that's anti-Semitic. And I was like, this generation is different, right? And thinking about this moment in time and like what's happening on campuses, I know it's different here in the East Coast. I was like warned by a lot of people. They're like, don't go there. Columbia is like turned into, you know, a police state, and they're having all these things. And it's like, this is what Zionism does. It actually makes the United States more authoritarian. Isn't that fascinating, right? It shows you the link, right, between these two ideological and political projects. And you know, for students who are on campus, you know, the universities. I'm sorry, as somebody who like is out of faculty, I'm gonna take my faculty hat off for a second and think of like somebody when I was a student. These universities are inherently reactionary, and the worst thing you can do is expect them to change. Right? Again, going back, I worked at Pizza Hut, man. My boss was racist. He was sexist. He did awful things. He said awful things. But I never was like, please, sir, can you just stop being a sexist for a moment? If anything we did, we got around and we like hung out after work, smoked cigarettes, and and like complained about the boss, because everybody hates their boss, right? At the end of the day. Putting my university hat back on. What I'm saying here is that sometimes, as student organizers, it can be really frustrating to try to change administration, because they know you have, a shelf limit. There's an expiration date. You're going to cycle in and cycle out, right? They know that this is part of that cycle. If you get a win, it might have, repercussions in the future, but you may not experience that win. But also, you should be organizing for power. You should be organizing in your community. You should be thinking beyond just these campuses. Because when you graduate, you're going to enter the workforce, you're going to do whatever it is, you're going to do. Join an organization that is not campus-based. Bring that struggle into the community, right? See where the community is at. This is something, as that I would offer, and take the tools that you learn here from our wonderful professors who are sharing the stage with me, and apply them, in your community work, because it's going to be much more fulfilling. Create organizations, build, right? I don't believe the university. I'm not one of those people like decolonize the university. I don't think it's too corrupt, man. It's not gonna ever be decolonized, sadly. But we can struggle on the outside of those walls. We can struggle in the communities to try to build alternatives. But that takes a different kind of faith and a different kind of capacity and a set of skills, right? To be an organizer in that way. And I just recommend looking into organizations that exist that are dedicated, not due to just mobilizations and campaigns, but that are dedicated for long-term social transformation. Because this is the long-term struggle.
Mark, what advice can you give to our young activists in training out here?
Let me go straight to Noura. I want Noura to have the last word.
Yeah, Noura can.
Deep study. I think we have the opportunity, but also a responsibility to deep study. There's a way that you don't need to read 10,000 books to understand what's going on right now as a moral atrocity. That's just, we can see that, right? But there's also a way that to understand, to struggle, and to fight, we need to have the vocabulary, the depth of insight, the knowledge, the inspiration, to be able to make these connections. I mean, that's part of what we talk about when we talk about all the organizing and all the internationalist movements and all the struggle that we saw occur throughout the 20th century. It was also motivated by political education and deep study. So I would say, read, form study groups, go to school, go to college, do all that y'all doing here, but also don't let college get in the way of your education. Like, read the books that you need to read to get free. And there are recommendations, there are book lists, there are community groups, there's all kinds of stuff we can do, and we can help, we can be resources to you, but at the end of the day, I think we can't be successful struggling if we're not also deeply engaged in study.
I want to add something to what I just said. I didn't mean like just totally check out of universities, join a union, right?
Oh, there's questions about you. Go join the union. That's right.
That's what I meant.
That's good.
That's
Well, that's actually perfect, because I was gonna respond to that.
Yeah.
And say, no man, you're here on this
Yeah.
campus, right? And I share this with students as well. Your audience is neither the administration, nor is it the immediate adversary that wants to, repress you. Your audience is other students. They are all here. The greatest form of education, as was stated earlier, is movement, right? That was I hate to say this because I'm a professor here, but my primary form of learning came from movement work and activism. I learned the greatest lessons there, right? And that's where we actually can change an entire generation of people who are thinking into the future. The same way that Black uprising basically brought abolition into our discourse in a radical revolutionary way. Right now, this moment is bringing in colonialism, anti-Zionism, Palestinian freedom into the movement in a radical way that's shifting the future. So you have all sorts of students, right, to build power with, right? To build power. What is power? Power is the ability to compel a particular outcome, or at least to control your own life, right? And so how do you do that in your, together, right? How do you do that together? And I had something to say about this, but I'll skip and get to the next one. The other thing that I encourage you to do, and I think is really hard as young people as well, is to take a deep breath. Is to take a deep breath. It feels like everything is burning. And oftentimes we burn ourselves in that process, right? And as somebody who did organizing work for many, many years from a place of guilt, what fortune did I have to be born with a blue passport and not in Khanis as a Palestinian? My life would be completely different. Complete fortune. And so that guilt drove me for so long. But when you're driven by that, you're also driven by scarcity. Nothing is enough. Nothing you do is enough. Nothing anybody does is enough, right? You don't trust people. You're not kind to yourself or others. And so to also be kind to yourselves, to rest, to enjoy one another's company, to know that that very world that you want to build is modeled in the relationships you're building with one another, right? And so that is, and if I have the last word, I actually want to read something that I began with Rafat al-Arir. He has this pin. He was murdered earlier today. So I will read his words to end. If I must die, you must live, to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings. Make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze, and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kids, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope, let it be a tale.
As I said in the beginning, it's Angela Davis who said that Palestine has the potential to further transform and render more capacious the political consciousness of our world. And I think we've seen some of that today with our three amazing speakers. So I want to thank Estes, Marc Lamont Hill, and our own Noura Erakat for being here and sharing with us. And thank you to all of you for being here. We look forward to